Yeah, as Sven has said, my name is Cliff, and I am going to talk to you a little bit about this idea of business agility and system science and Sapiens, how we use this. The talk was originally titled Beyond Copy Paste Agile, and you'll probably see a little bit of why that is when I start the talk. But yeah, I'm going to just jump straight in and show you my first picture. I'm curious, how many of you have seen this or know where this is? I was born in Cape Town. Well, I was not born in Cape Town, but I grew up in Cape Town. If you speak to some of my friends, they might say that that's a sort of a work in progress. I'm not exactly grown up yet, but I started the journey in this city. As you can see, it's quite a pretty city. For those of you who've had the chance to visit, you would know that in person. But it's a wonderful part of the world. My journey started here originally in product management. I worked in telecoms, a variety of different things that I did. And then a couple of years later, somebody managed to convince me to come and hang out here in, can anyone tell me where this is?
Stockholm.
Stockholm. Cool. Yeah, so I was hanging out in Cape Town doing some things, and I met some folks from Spotify, and they said to me, do you want to come and hang out in the cold and darkness? And I thought, sure, why the hell not? It sounds like a fun idea. The company's doing some crazy things. It'll be an interesting journey for sure. Hop's given a jump a few years later, and I'm now 6 years in Stockholm, actually no longer at Spotify, as you found out in the introduction. But yeah, it's interesting to know maybe a little bit, and I kind of like these pictures. You get sort of a sense of where I come from and what I've been up to. Before I get into too much of the detail of how I think about things, I want to start with a little bit of a story. Can you see this chicken on the screen? So I'm going to assume that the beep is yes. So the reason I show this chicken is because there's a story that I picked up once. I think I actually got it from my mother, ironically. And what I like about this story is that the story basically goes that a young kid is watching their parents preparing dinner. And they notice that as the parents put the chicken into the oven, they cut a little bit off the top of the chicken and cut a little bit off the bottom, put it into the pan, and stick it into the oven. And of course, for those of you who have kids, you know that the most common question that kids ask is, why? Or why do you do that? Parents sort of look at each other a little bit confused and they say, well, actually, I don't know really why we do this. I learned this from my parents. So they say, well, maybe we should ask our parents and find out what happened. So a couple of weeks later, they're hanging out with the grandparents and they say to them, what's the deal with this chicken? Why do you cut a little bit off the top and a little bit off the bottom? And the grandparents look at each other and they say, well, actually, we have no idea either. We learned this from our parents. And given that lifespans are increasing these days and people are living a lot longer, the great-grandparents are still alive. And so a couple of weeks later, they make a visit, or maybe in Corona times, they would make a FaceTime call or a Zoom call or something. But they jump on a call and they say to the great-grandparents, what's the deal? Why do you cut this little piece off the top and the bottom of the chicken? And the grandparents immediately start laughing and they say, well, my dears, when we got married and we first started living together, we actually didn't have so much money. And so our oven was really, really small. And the only way to get the chicken to fit inside the pot and inside the oven was to cut a little bit off the top and the bottom. Now, what I like about this story is, aside from what I think is funny, it also illustrates quite nicely, I think, something that a lot of us do inside our organizations, is that we borrow ideas from other people. We borrow from different companies, Spotify, Facebook, Google, everybody is doing something, whether that's a model or a tool like OKRs or something, and we borrow it and we copy it into our organization. But I think sometimes it ends up a little bit like this chicken. We don't necessarily know the reason why that thing ended up inside the organization. What was the problem that they were solving? Because if we have actually quite a large oven, there's not so much need to be able to waste or to spend the time wasting a little bit of chicken. If we have a different problem, maybe our solution could look a little bit different. So what I want you to do is kind of keep this idea in the back of your mind while I'm talking about the other stuff. The idea is basically that what we don't want to do is have a situation where we just say, let's copy and paste exactly what people are doing in other companies. We need to kind of think a little bit, adapt it to our context, and most importantly, out of all of it, understand what the problem is that you're actually trying to solve. Because if you solve the wrong problem, or you solve a problem that exists in Google or Spotify, but not inside your organization, you're probably just spending time to move things around and not necessarily going to be making things any better. Cool. So the other part of this story, and it leads me into another situation, is that very often when I talk with organizations, if they describe to me, continuing on the chicken metaphor, what does their oven look like? If you talk to the CEO of the company or you talk to the CTO or something, quite often you'll get this description, especially if they're talking to investors or doing some sort of sales pitch. Our oven is shiny and new and fancy and it's state of the art, everything is the best, and so on. And the challenge is that once you actually start to look behind the scenes and you dig a little bit into what's going on, you might find that the oven looks a little bit more like this. And in many cases, some of our processes and tools, everybody is doing agile, but the reality is that, we've kind of started out, maybe we're not so experienced with it, and it looks a little bit more like this, right? So the challenge that I want to put to you today, and what I want to try to answer with my talk, is this question of how do we move beyond simply copying and pasting what everybody else is doing, and learn how to actually build and tell if what we're doing is working, but also understand what problems we should be solving in the first place. Does this make sense so far? As I said to you, I want to talk about this question of what are we doing to move beyond copying and pasting, and how can we make sure that we're actually thinking about the detail of the problems we're trying to solve, but also how the solution would affect our organization. And I want to look at it through three specific lenses. And normally when I talk about this, I actually talk about them in reverse, but so as in system science and sapiens, because those are the parts that I have the sort of in order of preference that I have the most interest in. But what I think is actually interesting about this is that when you're doing this kind of work, we actually need to start with the foundation of thinking about the humans first, then understand whether or not what we're doing is actually feasible and effective. And then systems is understanding around the parts and the interactions. So I'm going to take you through it in kind of a reverse order. But the idea basically behind this is my area of interest is primarily in the systems, although I understand that the sapiens and the science pieces are also very important, and in many cases get massively overlooked. So I'm actually going to spend most of the talk this time talking about the sapiens side of it, because I think that is very, very, very foundational. Light touch on science, and then a little bit more time on systems. Cool. So, how many of you have heard the saying is that people resist change? Like, we want to work with humans, but at the end of the day, the challenge is that people resist change. You've heard something like this before, yeah?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or maybe you've heard a slightly different version of this, which is people won't work if we don't tell them what to do. And I have some challenges and some concerns with this, because for me, the challenge with these kind of statements is that it assumes that firstly, that our idea is correct and right, and that people are resisting simply because they're being a little bit stuck in the mud, or maybe they don't like change for whatever reason. But the other part of it is that if we don't tell people what to do and they won't work, if that assumption is true, that makes the assumption essentially that we have either the wrong or not so smart or not so capable people in the organization. Maybe they're lazy. Or to extend that a little bit, it's kind of we have dead wood inside the company. And the challenge I have with this is that if you think that you have dead wood inside your company, or you do have dead wood in your company, there's actually only two ways that it got there, right? Either you hired dead wood, in which case you have some challenges, or you hired live wood and killed it, right? And I think that what I want to talk about in this space of sapiens is really about that second piece. If you're hiring people who are actually not motivated and excited about your product or about your company, maybe you have some challenges, right? I heard the saying once, it says, if you want people to do a good job, give them a good job to do. And I would say that most of that is kind of addressing the first part of this point. The second part that I want to talk about more is how do you make sure that you're not killing the live wood? Because more often than not, and if you think back through your career, chances are you've left a company at some point, you've left a manager or a certain team, maybe because you lost motivation or you were feeling frustrated by certain things. I want to put it to you, basically, it's the company's responsibility in the large part to make sure that they're not doing things to kill people's motivation and desire to be effective and creative. So part of the challenge, I think, with this is that when we think about management and strategy and leadership, often our metaphors for this are a little bit like the picture on screen, right? We think of it as chess, somewhat of a deterministic system, if you'll excuse the slightly jargony language. But essentially, if I do this thing, something else will happen. And it's very much a sort of a clear cause and effect. If we analyze and understand enough of what's going on, we can know what the solution is, and we can predict the results. The challenge with this, though, is that, and oh, sorry, the second part of this is that basically we also have a lot of these dominant sort of machine models that dominate our thinking. And a lot of the machines that we think about are a little bit strange and weird. And there's many, many challenges with this. Human beings and machines are not the same thing, right? I think a better metaphor for thinking about people and about organizational effectiveness and design is really plants, right? Or gardening. When you want to grow plants, you don't sit and set a quarterly OKR and a growth target. You don't set it goals and have a weekly one-on-one with it. These kind of things, are not necessarily the things that are going to help your plant to achieve. Some people for sure will talk to their plants. They will tell you that it helps. But quite frankly, I think it helps the person who's doing the talking more than it helps the plant. The reality is if you want to create an effective garden, you need to think about it as an ecosystem. And part of what you need to be doing is that you need to create the right environment, right? You give enough sun, you give enough water, you move it in and out of the light at the right times, you plant in the right season, that sort of a thing. You create the conditions for effective growth to occur rather than trying to set a target and motivate the individual plants to grow. The second part of the challenge here, I think, is one that I want to talk about, which is a little bit of bias. So, can anyone tell me what's going on in this picture? Maybe you've seen this before.
Political discussion roundtable.
Political discussion around table. Can you guess what the topic of discussion over here is?
Defense budget.
Haha.
Was this
If it
something
was the
related to something for women? Deciding something for women?
Yeah, I wanted to say it. Yeah.
This is actually Donald Trump's Council on Women's Rights.
Yeah.
Right. In the middle, you have Mr. Mike Pence, sorry, the Vice President. And he is one of the people who was responsible for this meeting. And the challenge that I have, putting the politics and their specific political agendas aside, the reality is that with no woman, quite simply, I mean, maybe there's somebody hidden around in the background, but there are no women here, right? So how can you have a conversation about a topic that is really directly affects those people if they're not even present in the conversation? So the challenge I have with this is that very often we have a lack of diversity, and I will define this a little bit more clearly just now, but we have a selection bias. So we pick people who look like us, who sound like us, or people we used to study with, people we knew from before, that kind of a thing. And we end up with a room like this. Of course, it's absurd. I think all of us see this, that this group of men is discussing women's reproductive rights, but we do the same thing inside our organizations in so many different ways that are maybe a little bit more subtle. But once you start to see them, you'll realize how absurd it actually is in many cases. So I have another question for you. Can you guess or tell me what you think is going on in this picture? Maybe take a minute, just sort of think to yourself. If you have an idea, and if somebody knows the answer, maybe you want to shout out. Normally when I ask the question, I get answers like, oh, maybe it's a family reunion or it's a wedding. Somebody's come home, maybe somebody's graduated, they're celebrating something like this.
But there's so many screens on the back. It's not a usual family setup. So someone is in a business setup winning something.
Yes, they're celebrating some kind of success, and you see the monitors, but I couldn't figure out what it is. I don't know, looks like rocket something. I don't know.
So when I first saw this, I very much thought that it was much more in the line of a family reunion, something like this. And I think it's quite a powerful image because what it shows is a little bit of our bias about how we think about people who look a certain way or dress a certain way or a certain social context. The reality is that these are the scientists of the ISRO, or the Indian Space Agency, who have just successfully put a satellite in orbit around Mars on their very, very first attempt. They did it for about 1/10 of the budget of anybody else, and they did it the first time round. And it's a world world level feat. Like, it's incredible. But the idea that we sort of look at this picture and we don't necessarily make that association, because very often we don't assume that women are scientists or Indian women necessarily are even scientists. So I want to tell you a little bit about this. Where does this come from, and what can we do about this? So hundreds of years ago, maybe even more, all of us were living somewhere sort of in the wild, and one of these jumps out from behind a bush and starts running at you. It's not so helpful if your brain goes, he's yellow, he's coming quite fast, looks a little bit hungry, it's definitely coming into my direction. Oh, he's getting faster now. By this point, you are already lunch, right? We could not have that kind of a long, laborious, really deeply considered response to every single situation. What we needed to do was recognize straight away, there is a lion coming, or it looks like it might be a lion. Let's run away, because the cost of being wrong about this was so high that it was actually okay to have some false positives. If you ran away and it turned out it wasn't a lion, probably not the end of the world, right? The reality is that, and if you've read some of Daniel Kahneman's work on this, they talk about this idea of system 1 and 2. Basically, we have two modes of thinking. We think about things in sort of a deep, considered way, where we can make our rational reasons and thought processes and try to understand the world, and the other, which is really a fast pattern match. So we see something, we react in a certain way. The two previous pictures, I think, are partly the cause, and both our individual response, but also the creation of that political group, comes from our bias and our default tendency to operate in the style of snap judgment. We look at something, we make an assessment, and we act. We don't too often spend time thinking too deeply about it. Now, the reality is that we can't think too deeply about every single piece of everything we do, because it just would consume too much of our energy and our time. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to learn from this. And it doesn't help so much if we end up in this kind of a situation where we say, oh, well, you weren't listening. I just said, don't fall. We actually have to understand and think and understand what is it that caused the fall? What are the issues? And most importantly, we need to create safety, right? If you do not feel comfortable to be able to talk about the situations that you're experiencing, you don't feel comfortable raising a concern, we're going to have a lot of challenges in the organization. One of the biggest challenges that I see inside an organization is very often when you're meeting a leader, you feel a little bit like the kid on the far right side, right? It's a big challenge because it's not likely that you're going to share your inner thoughts or that great idea that you have. And certainly what starts to happen is that people will listen only to certain sets of folks. And that's a little bit maybe how you get Mike Pence's room that I showed you in the first photo. So the challenge I find is that if we have a scenario where you feel like meeting a leader feels like this, maybe raising a suggestion, right? Saying, hey, I've got this idea from a team, maybe a new person, something like this, maybe even people who've been around for a while. Maybe you're running a retrospective and it feels a little bit like this. It could be the Scrum Master that's creating that environment. It could be something about the team. It could just be the fact that you're new or you feel somehow like an outsider. You don't feel like your opinions will be valued. Perhaps you've experienced a restructure. Very often it can feel a little bit like this. The big people upstairs made a decision and told you that this is what's going to happen. You haven't necessarily been involved and you're kind of just on the receiving end of this, and it becomes a challenge. Same thing with a performance review, right? The challenge here is basically that if you want to be able to have an effective conversation, you need to start to level out this balance a little bit. So I talked a little bit about diversity. And I frame this as basically diversity as being invited to the party. So we need a variety of different perspectives in order to be able to understand the circumstance that we're operating in, right? A bunch of white men are only going to see a certain aspect of women's rights. They're not going to have the same perspective as women of a variety of different backgrounds, maybe even transgender women, gay and lesbian women. A whole different mix of people is necessary to be able to effectively evaluate that decision, right? So the first part we need to address is diversity, which is about the representation, or as I called it here, being invited to the party. And then we also need to address the inclusion. This is the safety piece. Inclusion is choosing the music. It's not enough simply to have diversity or representation. You also have to have people present and feeling comfortable that they can choose the music and will be respected for it, right? So if you have a challenge like this, the first step for you is probably to fix the diversity. The representation is obviously problematic here, right? But we need to go further. The second thing that I think that we can do is intentionally design around our exclusionary bias. And so I'm going to tell you a story of a few stories of different examples of things that I have experienced and that I've picked up along the way. So, first one is an anonymous CV screen. So there's we actually trialed this briefly at Spotify. There's a long story about why it didn't get rolled out broadly for quite a long time. But the short version of it basically is that we took the names and the name and the location off the CV So when you were doing a screening, you basically look at the CV and you're seeing the person's credentials and what they've done, but without actually seeing their name. And the idea behind this was basically what we wanted to say was we're fairly confident that folks are biasing based on, oh, this person has worked at that company or they studied at that university, or even just by seeing their name, you assume that they might be of a certain race or gender or from a certain country. And somehow we have assumptions that people from there are smarter than people from there. And so we wanted to try to remove that. And what we started to notice was that there was a far more balanced selection if we remove that information, because we were unconsciously selecting it into how we chose who would get through to the next round of interviews. There's a fantastic example from the New York Philharmonic Orchestra where they were doing interviews, and they found out that basically what was happening is that far and away, most of the applications or the application process was fairly balanced. So about 50% men and women applying for various roles in the orchestra. But the reality was that once people were being selected at the later stages of the interview process, it was ending up, I think the figure was somewhere around 70% male, 30% female. And so the question was raised, well, why is this? Because it doesn't necessarily make sense that men are better at playing instruments or anything like this. There's obviously something on the go. So they came up with this idea, and what they realized was that when you do an interview, one of the things that's happening is that you sit down and you can see the person. So all of the people on the selection committee were saying, oh, well, we are not biased. We just listen to the music and so on. So I said, how about we try it this way? We'll put a curtain down. You can't actually see what's going on and you can't see the person. You're just hearing the music. So what they did was they conducted a couple of rounds of interviews this way. And what they noticed was that there was a slight shift towards balance again. So roughly in line with the applications. So that's kind of what I would expect to see, is that roughly if you're getting 10 applicants and it's 50% women, 50% men, probably your selection criteria, I mean, maybe not on 10 is not a large enough number, but certainly you should expect to see something similar to being in line with the rate of application as the rate of hiring coming out the other side. What they noticed was that it shifted slightly. But then the question was asked, well, why is this? Why is it that we can't see the people, but we still, hiring more men? So I don't know how many of you have been to an interview before, but usually when you go to an interview, especially for one that is kind of a posh job, chances are you probably dress up, right? And can you guess for the woman, what was part of that dressing? What was the factor that was influencing this? How do you dress if you're a woman going to a fancy interview?
The different shoes. You hear it.
Different shoes. Yeah. So you wear heels, right? And most of the time you can usually hear, at least on a hardwood floor, you can hear heels in a certain distinct way. They sound different to formal shoes for men. So what they realized was that maybe this could be having an effect. They put a carpet down, blocking out the sound. Suddenly, hiring 50-50. So the point I want to make here is basically that even subtle forms, just knowing where the person went to university, that their name sounds somehow foreign to you and you maybe have a connotation of not being, certain way. Something as simple as hearing the heels on your shoes can affect how I think about you. And so what we need to be able to do is design around this. So things like anonymous and using a carpet, for example, can have an enormous and powerful effect. Cool. So I want to tell you about another example. Very often in organizations, what we do is we actually, I don't know how many of you have had this scenario occur, but I've had this a couple of times. A big restructure or a massive change to strategy is being announced. The leadership jump up on stage. They do a 20-30-minute presentation. The question is asked, does anybody have any questions? Pause for about 4.5 milliseconds. Okay, thank you very much, and done. And the end of the session, right? Have you experienced something like this? Because I think that this is a hugely problematic thing, right? Not only is it not really actually giving people time to give any kind of meaningful response, but it doesn't actually give me chance to kind of think through and meditate a little bit on the idea. The ideas and thoughts that I have snap like this in the moment are not necessarily my best ideas, right? When I've had time to consider it, maybe some time to think about it, some time to talk to my friends, a little bit of that sort of a thing, makes a huge difference. But we do this in meetings as well. We don't send pre-reading for some sort of proposal very often. We don't give people time to think, and we don't do any kind of meaningful follow-up afterwards. So if you find that all of your meetings tend to follow that sort of a format, one of the things that you can do is start to shift it and say, what are we actually biasing for? We're biasing for extroverts because we do everything in a spoken form. How do we include the introverts? Maybe have a conversation and see how that could work. We're biasing towards people who think very fast on their feet, or those who are comfortable speaking up in the moment. And what we actually want to get is the deeper deliberative thoughts. There's a time and place for each of these where it's maybe stronger than the other, but certainly worth considering and thinking about how your meetings and your interactions are currently set up. And this is another example from one of the groups that I worked with at Spotify. We had a standing agenda that was like this. We used it for the squad and tribe level check-ins, as well as at the mission level, which is kind of the sort of broader departmental level. But the standing agenda was basically that what we wanted to discuss here was these 5 points in order. So quite simply, what have we achieved or learned since last time? And this is not on an individual level, to be clear. This is as a whole group, as a team. What have we achieved or learned since the last time we met? What are we planning to do next? What is on our minds? What are we stressed out by? And what do we need help with? And for me, one of the most powerful learnings from using this process was realizing that as one of the leaders in the organization and as the set of leaders who were often on the receiving end of this kind of a briefing process, we were saying, actually, there's a big difference between something that is at number 4 that I'm stressed out by and something that I actually want to ask for help with. I may be stressed about it, but I've got it. We've got it in the team. We often have a tendency as leaders to assume that if somebody is stressed by something, my job as the manager is to step in and make that go away. And that's extremely disempowering as an individual if your manager is constantly sweeping in and taking away your big, juicy problems. You can ask, would you like some help with this? And you'll be amazed how often the answer is no, or yes, but in this way, right? Don't necessarily default to doing it the way that you would have thought of doing it. Cool. So I've talked quite a bit about Sapiens, and I want to move on to the other topics, but just to recap this one before we move on, there's 2 key things that I want you to take away from this, and that's that we need to firstly create the safety to try, whether that is succeed or fail, right? Without the safety to be able to fail, we cannot try anything new or novel, and we will just do everything that is, ironically, safe, right? We need to be able to run experiments if we want to discover new things. We need to try stuff. We need to be able to make mistakes, and we need to be able to do that in a group fashion. So we need the safety to be able to try. Secondly, we need to be able to acknowledge and design around our biases. And there's a huge amount of fantastic work that has been done on this, and I'll show you a couple of book recommendations in a minute. But there's a lot of really interesting things. Take the time to consider what are your biases? What are the default patterns that your organization is using or that you are doing as an individual? And how can we design around them so that they don't cause the issues that we find so often? If you'd like to read some books on these topics, 3 fantastic books. First one, Thinking in Bets, Annie Duke, won the World Series of Poker, fantastic poker player. Fascinating book about how we think and make smarter decisions. The one in the middle, Patty McCord, this is the story about Netflix and how their culture was created. It's a fantastic and interesting book. And Edgar Schein, Humble Inquiry, of specific value, especially for men in a dominant sort of male patriarchal kind of a vibe. Learning how to ask questions, but if you're also just a person who maybe struggles with asking questions and tends to default to rather telling people what to do, this is a really, really powerful way to learn the art of asking questions and how that can actually often be more powerful than just making statements and trying to be in charge the whole time. Cool. So we've talked about Sapiens. Now it's time to use the science machine, or talk a little bit about science and what do we mean by this. So very often what I find in an organization is that we focus so much on delivery that we end up building things that are not necessarily solving the problem that we may have thought we were solving in the first place. And quite often, this is partly a byproduct of the fact that we didn't actually think too hard about what the problem was that we were solving. We had some sort of vague notion, or maybe a leader over there gave us a task to do, and now we've done it. And what we realize is that we've actually developed all of the side effects and a bunch of other problems. We haven't actually cured the problem that existed in the first place. Another part of the problem is that we tend to do this thing where we extrapolate as humans, right? And if you can see this slide, this is from XKCD. I think they're actually... No, they're not both from XKCD, but this is from XKCD, which is one of the most wonderful nerdy comics in the world. It's highly, highly recommended. But the challenge is that we look at something and we extrapolate from it without necessarily understanding the bounds of reality. So things like base rate fallacy and all kinds of challenges like this, right? It's not likely that somebody who got married today is going to get married again tomorrow. And if you use the data points and extrapolate forward, you end up in this slightly absurd situation, right? Another challenge of what we do is that very often most of our prioritization or figuring out how to do stuff involves the process of essentially distilling away all the things that are actually meaningful. So we take something like importance and we turn it into an A, B, and a C. We take effort, we turn it into a 1, 2, 3, and a 4. We take urgency and we turn it into some similar numbers. We multiply it through some other voodoo and we come up with a number that says this thing is a 17 and that thing's a 12. But we actually have no idea why those things were actually written in that way and what's driving the importance. What's the difference between an A, B, and a C, and so on. And to me, a lot of this sounds a little bit, if you'll forgive the South Park reference, but a little bit like the underpants gnome saying, we've got phase 1, which is, we're going to collect underpants, and we've got phase 3, which is going to be profit, but we didn't bother to think about phase 2. We didn't explain how the thing that we're doing is actually going to create the other thing on the right-hand side, right? And this for me is a huge challenge. So referencing the book that I mentioned earlier, Thinking in Bets, Annie Duke talks about this thing. We have a tendency to evaluate the effectiveness of a decision based on the outcome rather than the data we use to make that decision. She calls this concept resulting. So a practical example of this is I win a hand at poker, so therefore I must be a good poker player, when in reality, I was just lucky. And if we don't account for the difference between actually smart decisions and luck, we're going to consistently start to think that we're actually a really good poker player, go all in on several hands and lose all of our money, right? We do this inside a business as well. Another part of this challenge, as Jonathan Haidt talks about in The Righteous Mind, is this challenge of the human mind tends to be more of a story processor than a logic processor, right? And what this means is that essentially we come up with the intuitive response and we say, this is what we think is the decision, and we make the decision, and we use reasoning to construct a narrative that explains that story, right? So we've made the decision, and then we use our rational process to justify why that thing makes sense. And one last point on this before I start talking about what we can do about this is fantastic. No talk in my mind is complete without a quote from the Don or Don Reinertsen. He says, decentralizing control requires decentralizing both the authority to make decisions and the information necessary to make good decisions, right? The idea here is that very often what we do, and I see this very often in organizations that have adopted Scrum without really thinking about the broader organizational context, we say, cool, the teams are autonomous, they're free to make their own decisions, but in reality, we didn't bother to give them enough information to really be able to understand the broader context in which they're operating. And I think this is very often overlooked. So if we want to get better at using science, what can we do? My first thought on this is to write down and quantify your hypothesis. This is a way to avoid the resulting, right? Simply state, if I play this hand, I'm expecting to win 25 or 35 or 65% of the time, right? What is the hypothesis? What do you expect to happen? We ship this in the market. I'm expecting 1 million new customers. We do that thing. I expect sign-up friction to be reduced by a certain amount, conversion rates to change in the following way, the cost of healthcare to come down by some amount. Just write it down. The goal is not to be precise or perfect. It's simply to give you something to compare to when you look back. Because the opportunity to be able to compare to what you thought at the beginning allows you to avoid this thing of resulting and go, there's a difference between what I expected and what actually happened, and that is your potential for learning. An example of how you can do this is to think about the concept of cost of delay. I suspect some of you have heard about this, but essentially if you think about it as if we had this feature, this product, this person, this process, whatever it is, what would the monthly benefit be in money terms, right? So how many customers, how often does it occur, what money is made, what money is saved? If we had this feature where we sell 10,000 units to 50 million customers, and however it works, you can do the simple math, multiply the things together, and pretty soon you start to get to a good answer. Of course, a big benefit of this is that you start to be able to have some effective feedback loops. You can have conversations between your folks who are making decisions around the prioritization in a way that actually involves data rather than opinions. So it moves the conversation from, I think this is the right way, to here's why I think it is the right way. Here's my data. And you could look at it and go, okay, I think your rationality makes sense. The reasons are good. except it's not 100,000 people, it's maybe 90,000. But in reality, that difference of 10,000 doesn't affect the prioritization or sequence of the work, so we're still going to do it number one, if that makes sense. We can start to then also compare as we iterate towards the goal and say, okay, so we've managed to get 10,000 of those things to happen, but we still need the other 90. Where are they coming from? And so it becomes a question of looking for, in an intentional way, the effect that you described, rather than simply trying to execute. The second part of this is to sequence your focus. And this, for me, is one of the most underrated things that people miss all the time. We're trying to optimize for busyness or delivery, but the reality is that we're letting number 3 on our priority list, or even worse, number 53, block number 1. So we have a scenario where the most important thing for the company is currently blocked because that person is on leave, this team is working on some other thing, marketing is busy having their quarterly offsite, and the sales team is busy trying to sell something else that we also won't be able to deliver because it's going to be at the back of the 500 things on the backlog. So what I want to talk to you about is this idea of don't let number 3 block number 1. So an example of this in practice, this is a visualization. If I talk sort of in flight levels jargon, which I will explain in a minute, we're talking about level 2. So this is a program or portfolio level board across a group of about 100 or so people. And as you can see on the far right-hand side there, there is a list of things called current bets, right? So this is again from Spotify, and this is the company level bets that say, these are the things that we are betting on that will be effective if we can ship them. So if you look at number 1, it says shuffle test on desktop. The challenge with this is that, or what we found was the challenge with this is that we needed to resolve the tension between team A and team B, who both could potentially work on this, but also on several other things on the list. So the heuristic that we established, or just a general operating principle, was to say, if I'm working on number 1 and you're working on number 3, if I need your help, you should stop what you're doing and help me. Within reason, not drop necessarily this instant, but if you're going to be busy for a couple of days, pause it and jump on to what I'm doing, because we want to keep number 1 working as fast as possible. Additionally, if you're working on number 3 and I'm working on number 1, you know that you probably won't get so much of my time until I am completely free. So if I happen to be idle for any reason, sure, I can help you out with number 3, but number 1 always stays number 1. Now, the challenge for a lot of organizations is they don't have something like this board or something like this heuristic. And so the reality is that what you're dealing with is you're dealing with a situation where everybody has a different idea of what's number 1. What we want to try to create with this is a shared context where we all understand what number 1 is. Now, if you have 75 things to do, which was the reality when we started out here, quite quickly when you build a board like this, you start to realize that most of what you've planned is actually not feasible because you don't have the capacity. And that can be painful at times, because sometimes folks in the organization don't want to accept the reality that your capacity is actually a lot smaller than you thought it was. If you remember the pictures of the ovens that I showed at the beginning of the talk, you describe your oven as the big, shiny, brand new one, when in reality it's probably one of the slightly smaller ones. And so what we want to try to do with this visibility is start to be able to understand what is really happening, not just what do we wish was happening. For sure, we want to try to pursue our ultimate dreams and goals, but if we're not there today, we're simply setting ourselves up for disappointment and failure. So, if you'd like to learn more about this, there's 3 books that I can recommend. Again, Thinking in Bets, and I mentioned The Righteous Mind. What I find most fascinating about this book is that it talks about how people think differently and how to be able to construct a story to get people to follow your ideas. I think it's a fantastic and powerful book. And the last one on the right-hand side by Melissa Perry is Escaping the Build Trap. And this is basically about how do you create effective product management in an organization so that you're making effective strategy rather than simply just to-do lists and wishful thinking. How do you build an organization that's not focused just on delivering, but actually on delivering the right thing at the right time? Cool. So to summarize the points under science, 2 things that I think we should focus on here. First, quantify your hypothesis, write it down. Just get in the habit. Don't worry about too much about the data. Just write down, I think if we do X, we will achieve Y. And when you're finished, compare the 2 and have a look, see what happens. And secondly, focus, right? Sounds easy to do in practice, but don't let number 3 block number 1. You need to be clear within your organization or within your own individual personal context, your company, your team. What is number 1? If you don't know what number 1 is, you're going to have some challenges. Cool. So, lastly, but by no means least, shall we talk a little bit about systems or how things fit together? I think I still have everybody with me. Cool.
Yes, you have.
Very much
cool. Awesome. So, for those of you who are familiar with Klaus Leopold, and you've seen some of his work, I give credit to him. He is, of course, also my business partner in the Flight Levels Academy. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about flight levels and the thinking behind it, because I think what it helps to do is frame kind of a little bit of the context of how we can work with this. So very often you have a team that is in this kind of a situation, and you see some sort of a board. And of course, we all know about the external weighting. But the question that we can ask in the situation is like, okay, so we do something that is in the backlog, we move it to next, we develop it, and we're done. And then what happens? Is that now done? Does the customer get value? And of course, usually the question, the answer to this question is, well, no, not really, because we're probably waiting for integration or something like this, right? If you don't work in a software development background, you probably have some other step after your team finishes. Maybe you need approval or you need to hand it off to another team, something like this. But usually these kind of things happen. So of course, now we ask the question, we say, okay, cool. Well, once we're done with integration, does this actually, now this is when we deliver value to the customer, right? Well, actually, usually we're waiting for acceptance as well, because we have to check with the customer, does this thing actually work, or with the product owner, or maybe with a larger program team. And then, of course, maybe once we're done delivering, there's actually some sort of a release step as well. And so what we find is that there's actually a large number of things that are happening on a semi-frequent basis. And so we're focusing on this kind of idea, and we want to try to be able to see more of our reality in our context, right? So if you look at what's happening on a monthly and quarterly basis, you realize that maybe this is not the world's most agile setup. If we go in the other direction on this board and we say, okay, cool, well, this is the backlog. Is this the backlog for the whole company? And of course, the answer is usually no, it's just that team or this development backlog. And if we go a little bit to the left, we say, well, what comes before that? And usually there's something a little bit like, if my slides work. Can you still hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, there we go.
There is it.
My computer just froze briefly, and it was not animating. Is this going to work? Cool. So I'll skip ahead one slide because it seems to be a little bit. No. Sorry, my slides are broken in some way. Let me see if I can play from here. Cool. No. Okay. No. Sorry, it's not doing. There we go. Okay. Something weird up with my slides. But the reality is basically, if we start looking a little bit off to the left, we end up in the situation where we start to see all of these things, right? So we actually have a product backlog, we have waiting for approval, we have several steering committees, we have rough ideas, we have triage, all of this kind of stuff that's happening in advance of what we actually do when we get to the building, right? And of course, as you can see all the way along here, there's several steps that involve quite a lot of waiting, right? Now, the challenge is that if you look over here, you'll see right at the far right side is the green bit, which is done. That's the part where we deliver value to a customer. But as we cycle through this, what's happening is that from the beginning where we had the idea and put it into the pool, something is happening monthly, some things are quarterly, some things are yearly. And so the reality is that at the end of the day, when we're focusing on being agile over here in the development step, well, we can be as fucking agile as we want, but the reality is that it doesn't really make any sense because we're spending so much time in the waiting steps, right? So to look at this another way, we end up in the situation where we have all of the red dots and maybe one or two of the black dots. Those are the parts where we're working. Most of the time, we're really just waiting, right? The reality is that if it looks like this, right, if you think about it as flow efficiency, we have some amount of touch time and the rest of the time is waiting, right? So you can actually graph this out. Jira actually has some plugins for this, although they're a little bit wonky at times. But there's a lot of different ways. Basically, if you just say, well, we spent day 1 here, we worked on it, day 2, we worked on it, and then we waited 6 weeks for the approval, you can start to quite quickly get a sense of how fast or how much of your time things actually spend moving versus waiting. Now, the question I want to ask you is, what is the value in trying to speed up the working step when waiting is most of the lead time, right? If we spend so much time waiting for this stuff, why would we try to make the developers type faster or move faster or try to write quicker or whatever it is that we're doing, when in reality, the handoff between the teams is what is taking most of the time? So if we want to try to address this, I think a way that's helpful to think about this is to try to visualize and manage for flow, specifically end-to-end flow. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about how we could do this. So some of you may have seen this picture, right? I've turned the animations off because they were being weird. But essentially, if you look at level 1 at the bottom, we have 3 or 4 teams who need to work together. In order for them to be able to work together, they need to be able to understand across those 3 teams, as I showed you on the Spotify board, what is the number one thing for them to work on. So what we do is we get some representation from those 3 teams, and we build a level 2 board. Now, this is not visualizing all the tasks and the story level detail the same way that we would on a team level board or an operational board. We're trying to maybe visualize something like a project or an initiative, maybe even a feature or a feature set, something like this. Of course, you can adapt it a little bit to your organizational context. The second thing that we want to try to do is we want to be able to tie this then to the strategy of the company. So most companies have some kind of a way of articulating their strategy, and they say, okay, well, we want to be dominant in this market, or we want to satisfy that particular customer segment, or we have some kind of a strategy that we're going after. And what we can start to do now is we can map the things at level 2 to level 3 and start to see, okay, that is how the thing that I'm doing in team 2 relates to all of the teams within that coordination space, but also how it maps to the strategy. Of course, a big part of what we're trying to do here is we're talking about feedback loops, right? You look at this picture, the idea that we're going for is that what we want to be able to do is we want to have the right team doing the right thing at the right time. We're not trying to keep everybody busy, because having each of those teams busy tends to create a large backlog in front of every single team. And as we know, a long backlog means lots of waiting, as we saw in the previous step, right? So what we can do is at level 2, we can start to say this thing is number 1, or even better, at level 3, we can say this thing is number 1, and it has a cascade effect all the way down into the organization. Of course, without the feedback loops, as I said, the challenge is that you can end up in a situation where it becomes too top-down, and you miss a lot of the context, right? You end up a little bit like Mike Pence having a conversation about something that really is not well enough understood by the members of the people in the room. And so if you're talking about detail, chances are you have people in individual teams, you have people maybe in product development, in marketing, in HR, in finance, who have a unique perspective that is actually important to be able to understand where in the process this is, but also how should we go about building this thing? What effects does it have on the business? What does it have on the client? This kind of a thing. So the feedback loops and the interaction between the teams is really one of the most important things here. So I show you this picture of the board again. As you can see here, there's several things that are going on in this case. So this is an example of a level 2 board. And what you'll notice if you look between the next up and the doing columns, there are 4 rows, right? The 4 rows each have a different label. So the bottom one is saying tribe improvement. So this is improvement work for the tribe or the team. This could be something like creating this particular board. It could be maybe some sort of an offsite. Maybe we're doing some sort of team feedback system, something along those lines. Next up above that, we have recruitment, sort of in the middle. So this is who are we hiring? What roles do we need to fill? That kind of a thing. And then above that, we have product and operations. So this is operating our existing products as well as building new features. And the top row is blockers, right? The idea behind visualizing all of this is that you want to try to paint a picture of everything that is happening within the context of the team. Because if I am not helping with that work over there because I'm busy doing some hiring over here, that obviously affects our capacity, right? All of the things on this board compete for the same capacity. And so what we want to try to do is manage that capacity in a more effective way. The second piece that I want to draw your attention to is that what it allows us to do is across multiple teams. This group was responsible for several systems that sit on the release blocking path of the iOS and Android apps. And so if there's something broken, it delays the entire Apple or Android release process. And we want to make sure that these are getting fixed or at least addressed with top priority. So every morning, we have a look there on the left-hand side. We have a new needs triage. Those are new tickets that have come in. In this case, it was being logged in Jira because we use the system for tracking bugs across the company. The ticket number is on there and a short description of what it is. We have a quick stand-up. All 85 people at this moment when this photo was taken was 85 folks working off this board. We did not have individual team-level boards at this point in time, although that did come about later. And the idea was basically what we want to do is we want to make sure that we resolve the challenges that have surfaced. So some new things have come up overnight. What do we do about them? So we say, okay, cool. Let's look at this thing. We've got some bug that's occurred. Can we replicate it? Do we know what it is? Do we have some people available who can work on it? If we deem it important enough for the blockers, we discuss it in the stand-up, we stick it in the top row, and immediately some people would work on it. If we decide actually, as you can see bottom left, there's a nope column, stuff we chose not to do. We couldn't replicate it. We decided it actually only affects one person, or maybe it has an effect that's not significant enough, and so we're not going to dedicate any resources to it. So somebody says, okay, cool, I will take that on, and I will go and communicate back to the people who reported it and say, we're not going to do this, and here's the reason why. So I think this is a great illustration of this kind of a flight level 2 system in practice. There's quite a few things that if you come from a strict Kanban world, you'll probably notice are a little bit different, such as there's actually no WIP limits on here. But the key thing that's important, and I would draw your attention to the top right, which is the current bets again, those are the key focuses. Those are the things that are important that we're focusing on. So we're not so much concerned about how the tasks are laid out on the board. There is blockers that are more important, and then there are the company bets. And so we want to try to focus on them in that order. Last thing I want to say on this is that the key thing that we're trying to do here is stimulate a conversation around the interactions between several people. So later on, this board evolved and it became each of the different teams then had their own board that owned maybe some set of systems, or they were focused on a specific set of features. And these little icons, you can see the faces that are on the board. They changed from being faces to being an icon for a team. But the goal of this interaction was really to try to facilitate the discussion of, okay, I've started this thing now, and I'm going to need your help in a few days' time. Can you be available for it? Yeah, sure. Okay, that's number one thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start something a little bit lower down on the list that I can finish in a day or two, and I'll be ready when you need me. But creating the space, as Don Reinertsen talks about, creating the space and the information that's necessary for making good decisions, that's one of the key things that I think this is helping with. It's not simply saying you're autonomous and you're free. We're building a systematic and methodical way of resolving the tensions and the frictions that emerge from people having different information and different priorities. So we try to collate it into a single view and build something that is coherent across the entire system. Cool. So if you'd like to learn more about this, the ideas that I've talked about in systems, 2 recommendations of books. Firstly, Rethinking Agile by Klaus Leopold. This book is available on Audible and several other things. It is really good reading. Give it a look. It talks in more detail about flight levels and some of the concepts there. And secondly, more of a general book about thinking in systems, as the title says, but systems thinking in more of a generalized context. So not only talking about software, not talking only about organizations, talks about ecosystems, about politics, about everything. Really, really fantastic book. I can't recommend that one enough. Cool. So to summarize this part on systems, I want to say really two key points that we've talked about here. The first one is you would need to go beyond the team level. It's not enough to optimize the parts or the individual teams. You need to actually think about how they interact together. So we need to be thinking about how do we build these level 2 systems to coordinate across multiple teams, and how does that connect to the strategy? And the second part, as I showed you with the slides with the different boards, is we need to be able to visualize the end-to-end flow. We need to be able to see from the point where an idea emerges right through to the point where it is delivering value. Because as Klaus likes to say, working costs money, but delivering makes money. And at the end of the day, our goal is not to keep everybody working, it's actually to make money. And so if we do a lot of work that we haven't yet shipped because we can't yet see the end-to-end flow, that's probably not so helpful in our organization. So just to recap, we've talked about 3 different parts here. So Sapiens, as you can see, we want to try to increase our situational awareness with improved diversity and inclusion. So creating a safe space where people can contribute, and so we can see more of our reality of what's actually going on in our space. On the science side, we want to avoid resulting and create focus by having ordered hypotheses that we can have some conversation about, debate, understand, and really try to use it to validate whether or not we were right before we started, but also so that we can learn more effectively. And in the middle, systems. Find way to improve through visualizing the end-to-end flow and creating the interactions between all of the parts. Cool. That's what I have for you today. I believe we have some time for questions, and I'd love to hear what you thought both about the talk, how this relates to your own individual context, maybe anything you would like me to expand on a little bit further, or how your personal experiences have been affected by trying out some of these ideas. So yeah, thank you very much for me. It's been